Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Corrin, and if you don't know anything about what I do, I cover murder cases every week, and this week will be no different, so I'm just gonna jump right in. This case has to do with the mother and wife, Joe, father and husband, Hal, and their two daughters, Michelle and Christy. Michelle was 17 and Christy was 14. The Rogers lived on a dairy farm in Ohio, and from what I've read, a dairy farm is a very, very big taking on. You have to be there every day. You have to milk the cows twice a day. It was so grueling that this family never even got to go on vacation. Not only did they not have a bunch of money, but they just had to spend so much time on this farm that they could never get away. In the spring of 1989, the family finally decided that they were going to take a trip. Now, Hal, of course, the father, had to stay back because, the cows still needed attending to, and they didn't have enough money to just leave it behind. But Joe, Michelle, and Chrissy were going to go. This trip was also planned because, sadly, the family had just found out that Hal's brother, John, had been sexually assaulting Michelle for 2 years. Michelle was now 17, and John was assaulting her from the ages of 14 to 16 in his trailer. Hal felt very guilty about this. He couldn't believe that he didn't know it was happening. He also felt guilty because it was his brother and he should have been protecting his daughter. And that was another reason why he really wanted his wife and his two daughters to go on this trip and have a really good time. So on May 26, 1989, the girls set out on their trip. They were driving from Ohio to Florida, and they made a number of stops along the way. They were doing a bunch of attractions because, like I said, they had never been on a vacation before. They went to a bunch of amusement parks and were staying at a bunch of different hotels. And there was really nothing wrong with the trip. They had already gone to the Magic Kingdom and MGM and Epcot and Disney World, and now they were planning on going to Busch Gardens in Tampa. So they arrived there on Thursday, and they checked into their hotel at the Days Inn, and they put their stuff down. They called home for a bit. They called Busch Gardens to get information, and that was pretty much their day. All three women were expected home on Saturday or Sunday. Sunday was the latest, mostly because Joe had to work that following Monday, and Michelle was planning on starting her summer school classes that Monday too. So Hal just was kind of looking out for them and waiting for them to arrive home. And Saturday and Sunday pass, and they never make it home. Of course, Hal had no way of contacting them. This was before cell phones, plus they were staying at a bunch of random hotels, and he didn't know if they were driving, if they got lost, if they had gotten to an accident. But one Saturday and Sunday passed, he was getting panicked, of course, and he decided to call the Ohio Highway Patrol. He called his local sheriff's office, and they had not heard anything. There was no report of an accident, so he just decided to report them missing because that's pretty much all he could do at that point. Monday goes by, Tuesday goes by, Wednesday goes by, and then on Thursday, June 4th, 1989, a female body is found floating face down in the Tampa Bay. Her hands are tied behind her back, her feet are bound, she's naked from the waist down. There's duct tape on her mouth, and they found a rope around her neck with a cinder block that I guess was supposed to sink her body, but once the body started to decompose, it started to bloat, and that's why it found its way to the surface. Shortly after, a second body was found in the Tampa Bay in the same condition, and then a third body was found in the same condition. When they pulled the bodies from the water, they assumed that these women were sexually assaulted because they were naked from the waist down, and that was proven later on in the investigation that they actually were. But there was also no bruising, no stab wounds, no bullet holes, no signs of strangulation, and that led them to believe that these women were completely conscious when they were tossed into the water. This was also proven by the fact that the youngest female victim actually was able to get one of her hands freed after being tossed. A week went by and there was still no information on who these women were. Hal still had no information on what had happened to his family, and he was still very panicked. But exactly a week later, Thursday, June 8th, the maids at the hotel were wondering why these women hadn't checked out yet. So they went up to the room and they noticed that the beds had not been slept in. Their stuff was just kind of thrown. It was like they just were in and out. And she got a little suspicious after hearing about the bodies and decided to call the police. The police came and they examined the room. They took fingerprints and compared them to the bodies that were found in the Tampa Bay, and it was a direct match for all three. At this point, they had to call Ohio and tell Hal Rogers that his whole family had been murdered. And their first suspect was, of course, Uncle John Rogers, because he had sexually assaulted Michelle not long before this murder. But he was actually in jail at the time, so he was ruled out. The second suspect was actually Hal Rogers. He was pretty much not breaking down as much as they thought he should. He wasn't really crying at the funeral, and that's always a red flag in these investigations. So they started to question him. They did some research and found out that he took out $7,000 in cash from his bank account in early June. So their instant thought was murder for hire. Did he hire a hitman to kill his family? Was there an insurance policy? Because those cases happen every day. When he was questioned about that, Hal just said, I took out that cash because my family was missing. I didn't know what was going on until you confirmed who the bodies were on Thursday, June 8th. Like, I took out the money early June. And he said, I thought I would have to drive from Ohio to Florida, so of course I would need cash. And when they asked him where the money was, he took them to his car, pulled out an envelope, and there was $7,000 in cash. So clearly he was ruled out right then and there. The day that the bodies were confirmed to be that of the Rogers women, the investigators began to search for their car. And they actually found it not too far away from the Days Inn, and it was located at a boat ramp. When they searched the car, they really didn't find much out of the ordinary besides this piece of paper from the Days Inn. It had directions written on it from the boat ramp to their hotel, so they figured that they had gotten lost and had asked for someone for directions, and this person was kind enough to write them down for them. And underneath the directions, there was a description, blue with white. Now, the investigators really didn't know what that meant, but because the car was found at a boat ramp, they had a pretty good inkling that whoever was giving them directions had a blue and white boat. The investigators put out all the information they had. They were looking for, if anybody saw the Rogers woman that day, if they saw anything suspicious, if they knew anybody with a blue and white boat. And in October of '89, a Canadian woman who had been traveling to Florida in May claimed that she had actually been sexually assaulted by a man on a blue and white boat. The police officers brought this woman in, and she gave them the description of the man that she claimed assaulted her, and they drew a composite sketch and put it into the newspaper. A local woman saw this composite sketch and she thought it looked familiar, so she called the police. She gave her tip. She said that, I think this man used to live next door to me, and his name is Oba Chandler. And they never got back to her. I'm sure the police got a bunch of tips, and she kind of just left it. This investigation continued on for 3 more years. There was really no more tips. There were no more leads. All they had was this information about the blue and white boat, the woman who claimed that she had been sexually assaulted by this man, and they drew a composite of him, and then the handwriting sample that they found on the brochure or the piece of paper in the Rogers car. When no tips came in for 3 years, they released this huge billboard all over Tampa asking who killed the Rogers family, and it had pictures of Joe, Michelle, and Christy, and there was a $25,000 reward, and it was just posted everywhere. In May of 1992, the lead investigator decided to hold a press conference about the Rogers woman and their murder, probably trying to spark some interest and, get it out there again, because it had been 3 years since they had been murdered. And that's when that same local woman who had commented on the composite saying, I think that's my ex-neighbor, got even more suspicious. She remembered that Oba Chandler was a contractor and used to do work like adding porches and other such things to people's home, and that her friend and other neighbor, Moselle Smith, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, had some work done by Oba Chandler on her home. So she reached out to Moselle and asked her if she still had that contract. And Moselle did. Not only did she have the contract, but she had a check that Oba Chandler had written on with his license plate number. The two women, who had obviously heard about this case all over the press, took the handwriting sample from the newspaper and compared it to the contract that Moselle had, and they thought it was a complete match. So they decided to fax their findings to the investigators, and again, it was just kind of lost in a sea of papers. And they never got any response, and they were getting so frustrated because they were so convinced that they knew who did this to these women. And they faxed it in May, and for months they were calling, asking, and they were not getting any information. So in late July of 1992, 2 months after they sent their original fax, Moselle Smith's daughter actually wanted to send it again. But instead of just sending the check and the contract along with a handwriting sample, she put on a cover letter and trying to get the investigators' attention. That cover letter was the spark that actually tipped off investigators. They were shocked that somebody could be so invested and so emotional about this case that they decided to actually look at this handwriting sample. And when they did, and when they sent it to a handwriting expert, it was a match. They gathered a bunch more evidence. They tracked down Oba Chandler because he had fled from Florida. And in September of 1992, he was arrested for the murders of Joe Rogers, Michelle Rogers, and Christy Rogers. After his arrest in September of 1992, Oba Chandler was put on trial for the murder of these 3 women, and he was convicted despite pleading guilty. He was sentenced to death, but of course that takes a long time to actually happen. But Oba Chandler was put to death on November 15th, 2011. I think this case is extremely tragic in many ways, not only for these women, but also for this man, Hal Rogers, who lost his whole family in one fell swoop by a man who was just so sick and twisted, and he lost them in the most horrific way. But I also think it's amazing that these 2 women fought so hard to get justice for this family that they didn't even know. Joanne Steffi, the woman who actually was the first one to contact about the composite image of Oba Chandler, claimed that she felt a deep connection with Joe Rogers and just wanted to get her justice, because she claimed that this could have been me. This could have been me and my daughters, and it's just so awful what happened to them, and this man needs to be put away for what he did. That is where I want to leave this case. If you have any questions or comments, or you have any cases that you want me to cover next, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Also, please check out my first video, which is about the Skylar Neese murder. I will put that link below. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Bye!